Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look at installing the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 rear airbags on a 2022 Ram 1500. Today's trucks have definitely gotten more comfortable as far as riding in them, and the Dodge suspension is very interesting in the fact that there's no leaf springs, and a lot of trucks are slowly going towards that. And it still has a lot of payload, and you can load this bed up and really use it as a truck still, but sometimes that suspension kind of gets to the point where it's doing the best it can, it's just kind of maxed out. And your factory jounce bumpers will do a fine job of keeping it from bottoming out, but there's really nothing to support the strain that's put on the suspension. Also, with the bed loaded up, the truck's going to want to tilt up in the front, and that's going to bring some issues when it comes to driving and as far as the lifespan of the vehicle's suspension. So it's going to put unnecessary wear on the rear. It's going to put wear on the tires in the front as well. Because it's going to be tracking a little bit different, that camber can kind of pull in, and you're also not going to have the steering feel. You lose a little bit of that contact patch because of the weight. It's just going to kind of get squirrely in the front, and steering feel kind of starts to get numb, which is not something you want when you're loaded up with a bunch of weight. Now also, with that front end lifted up, with that steering wheel kind of loose, you're also going to have reduced braking as well because you don't have that full contact patch. So not exactly a fun situation while driving. And if you're doing this at night, your headlights are going to be shining up a little bit. And that's not also great for you because you can't see, but other motorists are going to get blinded in the process. So adding the bags in the rear to stable that out is going to make sure that it doesn't wear out that suspension. You'll get your steering back, and you're not going to be blinding people as you go down the road. This is what the airbags are going to look like when they're installed, and you can see they've replaced the factory jounce location with the bag. So you no longer have that jounce spring, but the airbags are going to do a fine job of giving you that load leveling support and a comfortable ride, all while being able to load up your truck and level it out. Now these can give you up to 5,000 pounds of load leveling capacity. Now that's not to say that it's going to add directly to what you're going to be putting in your truck as far as payload, but this is going to help support that weight, and it's really just going to make sure that your factory suspension isn't overworked. So it's really there to help supplement that sagging of the suspension, and your jounce bumpers are great for when they bottom out and it's going to support it, but this is actually going to force that back up, bringing the truck nice and level. Now, as far as the installation goes on this, it's not too bad, but there is going to be a little bit of cutting. You're replacing the factory jounce bumpers, and those have a bracket welded onto the frame, so you are going to be cutting that off. So be prepared to have something to cut that with some wheels and some safety precautions necessary. You're also going to need to be raising the vehicle up to allow the axle to move and drop down to create that space. Now, it can be done in a driveway or a garage, and it shouldn't take you too terribly long to do. The main thing is just kind of getting that cut off and getting your brackets in place and running some lines. So overall, not too bad, and I'm going to walk you through every step so you can get yours installed. So let's take a look at that install now. We're going to go ahead and lower down our spare tire. This is going to just give us a lot more room to work underneath the vehicle, as it is going to kind of get tight as we're going to be cutting off the jounce bumpers. Now, this is kind of up to you, but just doing a few other previous airbag installs, it's a lot easier just having more room. You're also going to want to set up ways to lift the vehicle because we're going to need that rear suspension to droop down. So you're going to want some jack stands, and that way you can raise it up, have that axle drop down. So just make sure you chalk your vehicle when raising it up. Now, I'm also going to go ahead and remove our heat shields. Again, this install, we're going to be right where those factory jounce bumpers are, so you're going to want to give yourself as much space as possible. It's just going to make the installation a lot easier. So these heat shields, it's two-piece. There's going to be some 10mm bolts. You're just going to have one here, you have one here, and then two here. It's going to be probably the same on the other side, so just kind of go around, make sure that you have all the bolts off, and then we can set these aside. Now, during this whole installation, any of the parts that you take off, I highly suggest having a nice organized place to keep them. It's going to make reinstallation a lot easier. Now, if you are at home doing this on the ground, you can also put a floor jack underneath. I'm just using the hitch. It's a nice solid point to be able to raise that up. And as we raise this up, you're going to see the area where we're going to be doing the installation by those jounce bumpers. It's just going to be opening it up. So again, just make sure your vehicle's chalked and not rolling away as you do this. So So we're going to go ahead and remove the rubber portion here on our jounce bumper. And these you can just twist and pull to get them out. Sometimes they can kind of fight you. What I've found is you can use an extension, a screwdriver, or a pry bar like we have here, and you can just put it up in the hole and just kind of pry it. It makes it a lot easier than having to fight with it just by your hands. So now we're going to be cutting off this jounce bumper bracket. Main thing, make sure you don't hit your exhaust or other suspension. And I've put a little red mark here with a paint marker. And we're just going to be cutting along here, along the bottom of the frame. And you're going to have the same thing on the other side. So once we kind of get to this point, sometimes it's easy to get a pry bar and just kind of pry this down. But whatever cutting method you use, make sure you wear safety glasses and just cut cleanly here, making sure not to go into the frame. Now it is going to take some time and patience here. I think the best method, because it gets pretty tight here, if you can get a Sawzall in that angle, that's going to work great. But I used a carbide bit on an oscillating tool, and that's really nice to be able to change the angle to kind of get in there. Other option is a metal cutoff wheel on a Dremel, and that way you can kind of just work that nice line, make it nice and clean, and it kind of keeps sparks down to a minimum. So once you're kind of at this point, you can see mine is just about separated. You can use an air chisel if you don't want to completely cut, but as you can see, I can kind of get this to pop off. So what I'm going to do is go back with a little grinder here and just make this flush with the frame. And then also these sharp edges, I'm going to just round these off as well. And that way it's nice and clean for us. So just making sure we have that clearance, because eventually our bag will go right here. And then we'll come back and touch this up with some paint on that exposed metal. So I've gone and just kind of sanded these down to where they're pretty close to the frame. You can see it's kind of inset here. It's a little higher on this side of the frame where it's been welded. So I just made sure that this is nice and smooth. I've also smoothed down these edges. But since we have exposed metal, we don't want that turning into rust and corrosion over time. So I recommend putting a little bit of spray paint just to kind of cover that up. So I'm going to be just using some black here, just to coat those raw edges. Now we need to make space on our bracket here on our driver's side, and you'll see there's this little bolt. It's going to be a 13 millimeter. We're going to want to remove that, and then we'll be putting our spacer in between here, and that's just going to give this lift to allow the airbag bracket to live in there. Now these are hard lines, so obviously you're not going to want to push up too much on them, so just take your time, be gentle with them. You don't want these to kink or bend at all. And then we're going to be using the included flange bolt. And it's going to be a little bit longer here so we can thread it into this weld nut portion. So with your 13 millimeter wrench, you can go ahead and take that bolt off. Now the bolt that we're removing, we're not going to be using this again, so you can get rid of that. And then just going to kind of give it a little bit of leverage here, enough to get our spacer in. That way we're not stressing out those lines too much. And then we'll take our bolt, feed this through, and then get that tightened back down. So now we're going to want to assemble our bags before putting them up. And it's going to be pretty easy, but the main thing you're going to want to do is make sure that you have the proper brackets. So they're going to be specific, driver's side and passenger. You're going to want to check your instruction manual just to make sure that you have those mounted up together. Now we have these little roll plates here. We're going to get this right there, and this is going to be the top of the bag. This is where our push connect fitting is going to be, and that's how we get our airline ran to it. So what we're going to do here is take our bracket, and this is going to bolt down using this hardware. We're going to have a split washer and a flat washer, and we're going to leave these loose, and that's going to allow us to get this mounted up in the truck and still have some room to kind of work around with it. But before we do that, we're going to want to get our air fitting on, and you'll see it slotted here to slide this up. Now it's important to make sure that we have this properly tightened. It's got thread lock, and you're going to want it pretty tight but not overly tight. And what I'm going to do, just from what I've learned on previous installs, is I'm going to bench test this before we put it in the truck, because if you have a leak coming from this fitting, it is not very fun to get to and tighten that back down. So we'll go ahead, we'll get this put on first, and hand tighten already is tight because of that thread lock. So I'll come back with my 13, and about a full turn and a half normally will kind of get you pretty close to where you need to be. So that should be pretty good. And then what I'm going to do before getting our bracket put in place is I'm going to grab our airline tube that comes in the kit. And we'll be routing this in a individual run, essentially, to where we have individual control of each bag. So what I'm going to do is pull this out, find the middle, and then just cut that. That way we still have plenty of run for when we need to make our connection. But we'll be using this Schrader valve and the cut end to go into this push connect fitting. We're going to fill it up with air, spray this with some soapy water, and see if any bubbles come out. And that way we know for sure that that fitting is nice and tight before putting everything else on. So I've separated my airline and I've found the middle point here. Now, when making cuts on this airline tube, I'm using a tubing cutter, and this is really nice because it's going to get you a nice, clean, flat cut, because having burrs on here can really cause issues in those push connect fittings. And using you know, just like a pair of wire cutters or something along those lines, you're not going to get that clean cut. And even this one, I'm not too terribly happy with. That little oblong shape could make for you know, just a bad connection and cause leaking. So just make sure it's nice and clean, and you can kind of just rub your fingers over it to get any burrs off. So with that cut, what I'm going to do is plug this into the push connect fitting, and you should see it'll kind of snap into place, and a quick tug will show you that it is all the way pushed in. So now we obviously have air pressure in the bag. It's good we're not hearing any hissing, so we don't have any definite leaks, but a little bit of soap water here will tell the story pretty quick. And already it looks like we are good, because you'll notice if there is an air leak, you're going to have big bubbles forming as that air kind of pushes that soap out. So since we're good here, we can move along. And we're going to want to make sure we bleed all that pressure out of our bag, so you can push in the pin on the Schrader valve. So with that fitting in place, we'll go ahead and slip it over this oval shape here. And then we're going to line this roll plate as well as the bag and the holes here. And that way we can get this all bolted onto those threaded fittings. So we're going to go ahead and get these put in. Now, once we get these loosely tightened, you can see I can still move my bracket, but it's going to hold this in place. We're going to want to put our bottom bracket on, so we'll flip this over. We'll get this centered up here, and then we'll get our plate. We're going to have our teeth kind of facing this way, so just check the orientation, make sure you have it properly set up, and then we'll get these in place. We're going to be using these bolts here, and we're going to need to torque these down, so have your torque wrench ready. And we'll be using, we have a 7/32. I'm using a bit here just so we can use our torque wrench with it. So we'll get these tightened down. Now if you need to pick up a torque wrench, we have them available here at eTrailer. You can generally rent them at an auto parts store as well. This is going to be important because we don't want this coming loose over time, but we also don't want too much stress on the threads. So with those hand tightened down, I'll grab my torque wrench, set my torque setting, and get these torqued down properly. And before we get the bags in place, we're going to need to mount our bracket, and it's going to sit like this. You can see that there's some slotted holes here, and in the center is this square portion. So in order to get our bolts mounted up, we have these carriage bolts here that need to get fish wired in. So grab the coiled wire that looks like this in your kit, as well as a carriage bolt. And we're also going to want to grab a flange nut here. And there'll be two holes, so make sure you grab double of everything here. And the way we're going to accomplish this is pretty easy. We're going to take this coiled end and thread our carriage bolt on there. And what that's going to allow us to do is take this end of the wire, and I'm going to just make a nice little bend on it. I'm going to feed this into the square hole here, and those bends are going to make it easier to poke that through the top. And then we'll just pull this end of the wire, and then our carriage bolt, we should be able to feed through here. You might have to kind of give it an angle there. And then you're going to see we have our stud out. So I'm going to do the same thing on this bottom side as well. So now we'll grab our bracket and two flange nuts. And I'm going to just feed my wires through the corresponding holes here on our bracket. And then as we pull this up, We'll make sure that these pop through. And sometimes they can kind of get caught a little bit, so just jostle it around and we should be able to get that to pop through. Now at this point, the best thing that I can recommend, we're going to need to take the fish wires off to use them on the other side, but taking the bracket and kind of giving it some upward pressure here, that way the bolt can't push back in. We'll uncoil this to save for the other side, and holding that pressure as to not let that bolt drop in the frame. We're going to finish it up with our flange nut to hold this in place. So now we can go ahead and do the same for the bottom, and we can also repeat the same process on the other side of the vehicle. So now you're going to want to grab your driver's side assembly here, and it's going to have this little funnel shaped side in the bracket here, and that's just enough space for this carriage bolt to get in. Mine was kind of tight, so I just took a hammer and just lightly tapped it past here, just kind of over that hex there, and once that's in place, that's going to kind of hold it there. So this is going to create our mounting point for the bottom. So let's go ahead, we'll take this. We're also going to want to grab a carriage bolt, or I'm sorry, a nut as well, a flange nut, and then we can go ahead and get this in place. So at this point, we'll put this in place, and if you need to, this is a good time to raise that floor jack up to gain some of that clearance. You can see here it's kind of tight, but what we're going to be doing is taking our bracket and getting that portion where our carriage bolt was here to drop into this existing hole on that jounce bumper strike plate. So we'll just lift this in, kind of feed that in place. And then this is going to kind of lock into place per se. So if we come on this side, what we're going to want to do is align this to where it kind of slides under here, making sure that that kind of locks that in place, and pushing it forward and making sure that it's fully seated. We should still have our carriage bolt in place. So now we can take our flange nut, and I'm just going to loosely put this on that carriage bolt. Now we can see there's those two slots on the bracket, and one of them is aligning with that hole, so we're going to take a carriage bolt and feed it through there. And you're going to see where we pass that carriage bolt in, we're going to need to put a flange nut on that, and it's going to be kind of tricky to get to. I think the best method here, I'm going to put the flange nut in the socket, and this has a swiveled end on it, so just to give us a little more movement, and then pass this in as straight as possible, and then with that slot, that's going to allow us to get our extension to get this started. So you might have to push on the head of the carriage bolt to make sure that it doesn't push back, and then get this started here. So just take your time here, it's kind of a tight spot, so just be patient here. You can also kind of get an okay kind of view of it underneath, and there's a little window here that I can see it, so if that helps get it aligned, that will work. Okay, so we have this loosely on there. Now it's going to be the same story on the passenger side, except you don't have to feed that carriage bolt in that slot. They're just going to go in the two holes on the bracket and then feed here, and then it's going to be a similar situation that we had over there. There's still those tabs that you need to make sure lock into that jounce plate, but we have these all hand tightened on, so now we have both of our bags in place. So with all of those in place, I'm going to go back with my torque wrench, and we can go ahead, and all the lower bolts that we just put in can be tightened down. Just refer to your instruction manual for those torque settings. And while doing this too, it should snug it up, but kind of making sure that this is all seated properly while tightening. It's going to make sure that the orientation of the bag is nice and proper, and that way we're not crooked. So just go ahead, get these all tightened down and torqued. So now we'll need to grab two more carriage bolts and two nuts, and what we're going to do is pass these from the bottom up through these brackets. Now these can get a little bit tricky. You might want to grab a pair of needle nose if your hands are having trouble getting these passed through. You can see it's a little tricky here. It's kind of tight. There's also a slot underneath if you need to help kind of push along. You might be able to put something under there, but I just about got that thread through, just like that. And then we'll feed this through our top bracket. Now you might need to adjust the height with your floor jack if you need to gain a little bit more space here, because you might have a huge gap. but just enough to where we can get this hand started. And then we'll go ahead and do the same for the other side here. We can also go ahead and do the same process on the passenger side. Now at this point, you might need to lower your floor jack. You want the axle to raise up. That way we can get this bracket nice and mounted flat. And what we're looking for is this remainder here portion of where we cut that jounce bumper. We have that part of the frame there, and we want this top bracket sitting nice and flat. And what we're going to do is tighten these first, and then we'll do these ones. These will need to be torqued to spec as well, so make sure you have your torque wrench handy. So I'm just going to make sure that I'm pushing this so it's all the way butted here, and also that it's nice and flush, and that should cinch up as we tighten it as well. So I'm going to tighten this bottom one to kind of get that flat, and then we'll go ahead and torque these down. Now you can raise your axle, so take out your floor jack or whatever you have supporting it, and that way it's going to sit kind of how it's wanting to naturally. Now we do still have the 2 bolts inside of the bracket that we left loose earlier, and that's going to allow us to move this lateral side to side here. So what we're going to be looking for is making sure that it's pretty well perpendicular. Now if the bag looks crooked from this side, that's actually okay, that's kind of normal. But you're going to want this portion nice and straight up and down, and then once you have that there, I would use a ratcheting wrench here, and it says a 3/8 in the instruction manual, but this is a 14, so grab your 14mm ratcheting wrench, and we'll go ahead and get these tightened down. Now obviously a torque wrench isn't going to get in here, so you're just going to want to make sure that they're nice and snug. You don't need to over tighten them, but you'll know pretty quickly when it's tightened down. Now with everything tightened down and torqued to spec, our airbags are essentially installed. The only thing left to do is route our airlines so we can fill them. Now I cut mine previous to do our bench test, and the way that we're going to be running this is going to be able to be a system where you're able to control both bag individually. I've mounted them here right by the license plate. This seems to be a good spot that's accessible, and you also have individual control of each bag. Now there is a series of flat washers, rubber grommets, as well as a star washer and nuts to get these in place. So look, refer to your instruction manual for that, and then you can kind of adjust them as far as how far they stick out, however you want them. So here it looks like where they poke through in the back, and so I've gone ahead and split them to each individual bag. So let's go ahead on the passenger here, just zip tied it along on a few different spots. My main goal is staying away from exhaust or any moving parts. I've left a little bit of extra here just in case they later want to tie into a compressor, and then just route it over here. Now I put this thermal shield that's included in the kit, and that's because it gets really close to the exhaust here, and you really can't mount the line on the other side because it'll be right at the spring. So putting this here is going to protect that line from getting burnt, and then I've just attached it there. You can see I've also put the heat shield, and that's to prevent the heat from really breaking down the bag over time. It's just going to create a nice little barrier. Now driver's side is pretty simple here. Just kind of use some of our factory wiring to zip tie it on, and then a hole in this frame little rail here. I've gone through here. Now I've left a little bit of extra slack too as well, because as this raises and lowers, you don't want it to be too tight. Now on this side, that hose is going to want to kind of curl towards the exhaust, so zip tying just to kind of hold it here in place to keep it away from the exhaust is really going to help prevent damage long term. So now that we have it ran, we're going to go ahead and put some air in the bags. And putting air in the bags is going to be nice because we can test to make sure that all of our lines are solid and that we don't have any leaks. And just as we bench tested earlier, the best way to do this is go to all of your connections and spray some soapy water, and with that pressure there, if there's any leaks, we're going to see big bubbles forming, and then we'll tighten down if there are any. And since we're running this to each individual bag, really all we have is the connection here and then where we install them in the bag. Now if it's coming from the quick connect fitting on the bag, you're going to want to go back and make sure that's tightened down, or potentially the cut that you put on the line might be bad, so you might take that out, cut it, make it sure that it's clean and that you've cleaned the line, put it back in, and that might fix the leak. But pretty much you're going to want to make sure that all those big bubbles have stopped forming. So now that we have no leaks and we have air in the bags, all that's left to do is get our heat shield and our spare tire back up. and then we're ready to start using them. And that was a look and installation of the Air Lift LoadLifter 5000 rear airbags for a 2022 Ram 1500.